Chapter 15. Mary. Mary laid out the final piece of cut fabric and stood, stretching her aching back.
Everything is cut out, Elizabeth. Wonderful! I'm almost finished with the first dress for Mrs. Thompson, so I'll get started on it in a bit. How about we do a quick lesson and then you can see if Mr. Brown needs any help?
That sounds fine to me. Mary enjoyed the lessons, and though she hadn't expected to, she even found herself enjoying the stories from the Bible. But she didn't know when she would really use the skill of reading. Elizabeth pulled the Bible from her bag and then opened it up to the book of Mark they'd been reading from. As they began to read, the bell chimed downstairs, and the sound of conversation carried upstairs. Mary tried to keep her focus on what Elizabeth was saying, but when her ears picked up the word catalog, she lost her focus.
Elizabeth, I'm so sorry, she said, interrupting her friend. But I think that customer is here because of the catalog. I'd love to hear how this goes. Do you think we can continue this a little later?
Elizabeth smiled at her and closed the book.
Of course we can. Why don't you go see if Mr. Brown needs any help, and I'll work on Mrs. Thompson's dress. We can finish the lesson tonight before we leave. Thank you.
Mary hurried downstairs in time to see an older woman with short gray hair looking at the curtains Mr. Brown had gotten from the order.
These are beautiful, and you say they came from a catalog order?
Yes, ma'am, Mr. Brown said. There are quite a few things you can order from the catalog.
Yes, that is what Willie said when he appeared at the inn. May I see the catalog?
Mr. Brown nodded and returned to the counter to grab the catalog. As he did, he caught Mary's eye and smiled at her. Then he handed the woman the catalog. As she began to leaf through it, the bell sounded again and Sarah Miller appeared. As Mr. Brown was busy with the other woman, Mary approached the younger woman.
Hello, Sarah. Are you here to see Elizabeth? I'm not sure she started your dress yet. Oh, I'm not here about my dress. I know she'll get it done when she can. I'm here because Willie came in waving some catalog flyer and saying I needed to come see what was offered. Is there a catalog here that I can look at?
Mary couldn't believe it. 2 women within minutes of each other? She had expected the catalog to be successful, but this was even more than she'd expected.
Mr. Brown has one, but that woman is looking at it currently.
She pointed to the woman at the counter with Mr. Brown.
That's okay. I don't mind waiting. I'm excited to see what all is offered. There is a lot. While you wait, you can check out the flyer closer if you'd like. We hung one on the community board. Thank you, I will.
She headed over to the board and Mary returned her attention to the woman with Mr. Brown. I'll take the curtains, and I'd like to place an order, the woman said.
Wonderful. He looked up at her. Mary, can you get the curtains for Mrs. Davis while I take her order?
Of course. Mary hurried to gather the curtains, still surprised that they had sold within a day of being up. She brought them back to Mr. Brown, who boxed them up and then handed the box to Mrs. Davis.
I'll notify you when your order comes in, he said.
Thank you, and I'll be sure and share the word. Do you have a flyer I could put in the inn?
Of course.
He reached under the counter and handed her one, and when she was gone, he returned his attention to Sarah Miller. Sarah placed an order, and then she too left the store. As she did, Willie entered, a big smile on his face.
I did what you asked, Mr. Brown. I've told everyone I could think of. Have you gotten any orders yet?
Mr. Brown smiled and nodded at the boy.
2, Willie. So why don't you grab a candy for yourself and one for your sister?
Willie's eyes glistened as he nodded and reached into the penny candy barrels. He quickly grabbed 2 pieces and then scurried away, promising to try and send more customers in.
What was that about?
Mary asked.
Mr. Brown shrugged. He's a good kid, but poor. I asked him to spread the word about the catalogs and told him he could have a penny candy for each customer he sent in. He's got a little sister, so he wanted to make sure he had enough for her as well.
Mary smiled and shook her head.
You are a big softy.
Guilty as charged.
The two locked gazes for a minute, and then Mary glanced back to the upper room.
I suppose I should get back up there and see if Elizabeth needs any help. Plus, we have a lesson to finish.
Before you go, can I ask you something?
Of course.
Mary had no idea what Mr. Brown might want. It was too late to stock shelves tonight, wasn't it?
I was wondering if I might walk you to Mrs. Nelson's tonight, he said. I know I invited you to church on Sunday, but I would like to officially court you as well.
Oh, well...
Mary hadn't been expecting the offer, but she desperately wanted to accept it. Surely Elizabeth would understand.
I would like that.
He smiled at her.
Wonderful. I'll let you get upstairs then and see you when it's time to close.
Mary finished her lesson with Elizabeth and then helped where she could. And before she knew it, it was closing time. She bade goodbye to Elizabeth and then waited while Mr. Brown locked the store. Then he held out his arm, and she put her hand through, sure that she was more red than the curtains he'd just sold.
Thank you for allowing me the pleasure of walking you home. I was thinking we could do this every night, as you're living in town now.
I'd like that.
Mary couldn't believe this was real. A man, a kind man, was taking an interest in her.
My Maggie and I used to walk the town every evening after we closed the store. It was a perfect way to decompress after a day.
I can understand that. When I was in Chicago, I would get out and walk whenever I could, though I had no one to walk with me.
Well, now you do.
At the entrance to Mrs. Nelson's house, he bid her good night, and Mary watched him walk away until he was out of sight. Then she turned and entered the house.
"Well, don't you look like the cat who ate the canary?"
Mrs. Nelson said from her chair in the parlor. She paused her knitting and fixed her shrewd gaze on Mary.
"Did something happen today?"
Mary chewed on her lip as she sat down on the other chair. She wanted to tell Mrs. Nelson everything, but she was also afraid that if she did, it would jinx it.
"Come on, out with it, girl."
All right. Mr. Brown walked me home tonight, and he's invited me to go to church with him on Sunday.
Mrs. Nelson flashed a knowing smile and nodded.
"I figured that would happen. Well, good for him and good for you."
How did you know it would happen?
Mary asked, genuinely curious.
"God has a way of putting people together who need each other."
You think God put us together?
Mary wished she understood this faith in someone unseen that everyone around her seemed to have.
"I know he did. Mr. Brown is a good man who was widowed too soon, and you are a good woman."
You barely know me. How can you say that?
"I'm a good judge of character,"
Mrs. Nelson said, returning to her knitting.
I wish others saw me as you do,
Mary said softly.
"They will,"
she said, not looking up from her knitting.
"Some people just have to look beyond the outside and see what's inside, and some need more time."
I don't think you understand.
Mary pressed her lips together, unsure if she should share her past with Mrs. Nelson. Elizabeth had told her not everyone would understand, but Mrs. Nelson seemed different.
I used to work in a saloon in Chicago.
"But you aren't there now."
Mary could not believe how little this seemed to matter to Mrs. Nelson.
No, but only because Elizabeth came and brought me back here.
The needles paused for a moment as Mrs. Nelson looked up.
"Then you should praise God for friends like Elizabeth Baxter."
Had
God had something to do with Elizabeth rescuing her? Did he have a hand in Mr. Brown asking to court her? Why would he be allowing good things to happen to her now when he ignored her for years? The questions swirled about in Mary's mind as she watched Mrs. Nelson knit.